Hey, welcome back to Builder Funnel Radio. Today we got another great episode for you. Today I talked to David Supple, and we are going to dive into design build and kind of the movement that we're seeing. And David has kind of become a student of design build, and so he takes us back to some of these original architects, and we talk about how the actual terms were defined, and then there's kind of this great divide, and basically end up talking about how do we start solving for this? How do we provide a great experience for the customer? I think you'll find it really interesting. I enjoyed the history part of it, but also there's some good actionable things for all of you guys that were kind of in the midst of this. And so educating the consumer and also getting this education into more schools so we can start to maybe solve some of our labor problems. So a lot of good stuff in this episode. Sit back and enjoy episode 69 with David Supple. Hey, David, glad to have you on the show today.
Oh, thank you, Spencer. It's a pleasure, man.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. Yeah, you and I connected a little bit ago. We actually were talking about potentially working together, and then we started just talking about this whole design build thing. We said, hey, let's have a conversation about it. But before we go down that path, maybe you can just give people a little bit of your background, kind of like how you got into construction, and then maybe what you're doing now.
Yeah, sure. And I appreciate the platform. I admire what you do a lot. So
thank you. I appreciate that.
But my background is I went to school for architecture. I have a degree in architecture. I wanted to be an architect. I got out of school. I started practicing as an architect, and I realized I had no idea what I was doing. I had never built anything in my life, and my education was very theoretical. And so when it got time to like real world, like this plan is going to go and be executed, it just did not make any sense to me. That I had, no confidence that what I was putting down was going to be successful because I had never done it before.
Sure.
And so at that point, I was like, I need to fix this. So I worked as a carpenter for a while until I felt I had filled that void. And then I started my own company. So we were always a design build company. And I would design a project and then build it. And then over time, I've shed hats and have an organization now, and we're a team. So there's individuals who have their own, role within the company, but we're a team, and we are single source accountability for a client for residential remodeling.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah. And I don't think you see that too often, except maybe in the last few years, people actually starting as design build, and as that, philosophy has been, I guess, adopted more and more in the last few years. I feel like most people started either on one side or the other.
Yeah.
Right? And then in the last little bit, people said, oh yeah, this is a good approach. But I know we have a lot of listeners that maybe are using that approach, but probably a lot that are not as well. So maybe we can just start and kind of define it. Like, how do you see design build?
Yeah. I mean, design build is really about setting up a project for success. And to your point of you see it's become a more common theme or way to folks are going. But that doesn't mean if somebody calls themselves design build, you need to look a little bit further, because it is all about setting up a project for success. You could have a setup where it was a separate architect and a separate builder, but if that architect was thinking with execution the whole time while they're designing, and wherever they didn't know stuff, a contractor was filling that void in terms of cost and executability of plans. That's really the secret of design build. Mm-hmm. And the thing that I have is a knowledge I've done a ton of research. I'm writing a book on the true history of the architect, and the design builder of today is the architect of old. The architect throughout history built. The derivation of the word architect is master builder. And there's a huge misconception in society today where, you and I grew up thinking the architect was primarily a designer. It was, it's been made to appear that way. It's been made to appear like these great architects of the past were mainly designers, when they were not. They were executors. They oversaw a project from conception to completion. And from that, it only makes sense, right? Like an analogy I give a lot, which is effective, is a chef who never cooked in his life.
Sure.
That's what I was when I got out of school. I just learned how to write recipes, but I never actually cooked anything in my life.
Yeah, never executed, right?
Yeah, what kind of chef would you be? So
yeah,
there's architects out there, the greats. You talk to them, they know how to build.
Yeah.
And they can think with it, and they know what things cost. And it's not just, their job is not just to create something beautiful. So, design build is all about, in the design process, setting up a project for success, going in the right sequence, not designing this project and only thinking with what the client is going to love aesthetically and the perfect, but cost, dude, like if it can't be executed, if it's two or three times their budget, that's a problem.
Yeah. Then it never happens, and then it's
that's
not
right.
a success. Yeah, I like how you defined it, like it's setting it up for success, and defining success is, it's got to get completed.
That's right. Yeah. And that's why you find the uber rich are more known to be the ones who hire architects.
Yeah.
And what I see from that is it's because they have the means to do the project anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, let's go back in time. I know you've been diving into the history. You said you're writing a book, and you and I talked about this, and it was fascinating. So let's start at the beginning. With what you've been researching in history, like with architects. You mentioned the term master builder,
right?
And then I want to work into. We'll get to it, but kind of why we had this divide. Why it split. But where did it all begin?
Cool. Yeah. I mean, in terms of documented history that we have, there's 6,000 years of recorded history. And if you go back and look at from the earliest time of, Babylon and Egyptian times, throughout history, the word to define somebody, there was never a word to describe somebody who only designed. The word has changed over time to define the same thing, which is the overseer or the responsible entity for a building project. Architect is one that goes back to ancient Greek age, and the derivation, if the root of the word literally means master builder. And our audience is familiar with you have an apprentice, and then you're a journeyman, and then you're a master in the trades. That applies to many trades. It was the same deal back then. And once you were a master, now you could direct and design and, tell folks how and what to build. And then through the Middle Ages, you had that word architect go out of use, and it was replaced primarily with different words, but master mason.
Okay.
And if you're ever in Europe, you will understand why, because the shit is all stone.
Yeah.
So if you built, that was the foundational material. And so that was the trade you came up in. And when you were a master mason, some of them then turned around and directed these projects. And then you had the Renaissance. The Renaissance was really a return to antiquity, because you're coming from Gothic, medieval, if you just get a visual of those buildings. That was the style in play. What happened in the Renaissance around 1500s is they found this book called the 10 Books of Architecture by Vitruvius. He was a Roman architect, and he had written this book, and they found it, and he talked about how to build in that style. And he talked a lot about a lot of things, but which I'll get to later. But this style was the real push of the Renaissance. It was just getting back to, and so the people of influence, the people with money, wanted this style.
Sure.
And so, but all the architects at that time didn't know how to produce that. The first folks that did were educated scholars, because the book was in Latin and most folks didn't speak Latin, only the highly educated. So this is where you first got this connotation of the architect as the designer, because the word came back into use at the same time, and it had this connotation of style and design, because it was really a focus on like, give me this style. And you know, an example of this is, and this is kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but when universities started to look for a curriculum of like, who's done this before, they found the French king at the Renaissance wanted this style, and he had an army of master masons, an army of architects, but they couldn't build that style that he wanted. So he started a school to teach them this style. But they were already builders, right? So the thing that's missed when the American schools started to look for a curriculum is like they skipped the whole fact that they were builders.
Yeah,
they were masters.
Yeah.
This little insignificant point, which is huge, but it's a subtle point. I've never heard it talked about. But the Beaux Arts in France, like before American schools started to adopt these curriculums, that's where Americans were going. But they missed this point. So anyway, in a nutshell, the history is that the architect always built. It's like, sure, you can go back. It's just been made to appear that that wasn't the case.
So as it got transferred over and we started building curriculums in universities and schools, we missed that building piece. So people just developed the design skill set, and then because they had that knowledge gap, we started to see this divide. Is that kind of what happened?
Right. And it goes further than that. Like, it's a conspiracy. I'm serious, because I've read these books. I've read the books that have been commissioned by these universities that are on the history of the architect. They will take a quote from, say Vitruvius. Vitruvius, the first chapter, he defines what an architect is. And he says you need the theory and the practical. And he defines the practical as manual labor, using your hands, and the theoretical of artistry and of use and knowing what your client needs. And then in the 1900s, these books would take that quote and attribute it. They would leave out the manual labor part, and they would attribute it to the practical skill of drawing. Like, that's not what he was saying. It's just not.
Yeah.
And there's several examples of this where it was made to appear. And that's why you have a society that is below ignorance on the subject. They think it's normal. They think it's always been separated. It's totally normal to have this setup when it couldn't be further from the truth.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. It's very interesting, but you can see how it happened, and what, it sounds like, you said there's a conspiracy behind it. So maybe people said, hey, here's the opportunity, and they took that and ran with it. But I guess what I'd be interested to kind of dive into is, now, if we know the history and we know that this design build process is really it's a better process, it's the way to achieve that successful outcome. There's a lot of remodelers and builders listening. that maybe are design build, but then some that aren't, why should somebody, adopt that methodology?
I mean, for me, it's really just about taking care of the client.
Yeah.
And like we talked about, is setting up a project for success. And so when we're designing and we're presenting options to a client can be presented with just, space plans and, style boards, design boards, and make decisions based off of that. But if they're doing that, they're inevitably have the possibility to return to that decision once cost is made part of that decision-making process.
Totally.
And architects today, in the majority, because they don't build, don't know what things cost. Even if they do give an idea of what cost, there's no accountability for it. And so it's an extremely problematic situation where you have projects that are, go out to bid, they can't be executed, or there's a urge for the client to go for the low bidder, or just kind of sacrifice the coolest parts of the project. It's just not an efficient way to do it. And it's a win for the client design build. It's a win for the design builder, because architects don't like that, and it's also, I feel like a lot of the times I'm just bagging on the architect, but it's also about the contractor who's, say, just letting the client do the design. And the client is the designer, but they're not qualified.
Yeah, they have no
So they're
idea.
going to make mistakes, or they're going to, and when the project is over, the client's going to have regrets about things they could have done if they had been led by a designer who knew what they were doing.
Yeah, no, that's good stuff. And I like, it all comes back to the client, and if the client's successful, then you're going to find that success. People are going to be happy with the experience, and that helps you, grow as a company. We were talking a little bit before the show started, and talking about how these worlds like architecture and then, building or remodeling, they're really starting to collide back again, as design builders talk more and more about. But I guess, what would you say to companies that are just architects now, or just remodelers, in terms of how do you make the move to get to this point where you are competent in both? Because maybe they were only trained on one side, and so they're going, well, how do I do this? How do I bridge the gap?
Yeah, I mean, I started off this way, so I don't have a blueprint for switching per se. But I mean, I think it starts with an acknowledgement. I mean, if things are going great and there's no need to, but I'm sure they're not. And so what I found is, even the folks that call themselves builders, and I can think of a bunch, and they are not design build. They say they're architects, and if you look a little closer, it's a design build model, and they're pairing up with an architect, or conversely with a contractor, a builder, at the beginning of the design phase. And so that client is still, while not the same entity, they have like a pre-construction the builder has a pre-construction scope to fill the void that the architect is not able to fill, which is cost, executability, setting up the resources, having trade contractors look at specific aspects of a project, huge benefits in all of that. And so, I mean, I'd say first, just confront it, or just start raving, like speaking out against it. I want more of that, actually, because I know once that happens, we're making some progress. You know?
For sure.
But then, I think the easiest gradient would be to pair up with a similar philosophical, if you're a contractor and architect, or architect contractor, and just looking and making sure all the bases are covered, and defining, hey, okay, I'm going to just do the design at these points. We're going to consult, and and then so then when we present to a client, we're going to be able to give them the options, that are executable and are what they want, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I
it's,
think,
yeah,
go ahead.
it's just that collaboration.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and especially that move there where you don't necessarily need to make the leap to hire somebody, because that may be, somebody's like, oh, well, I'm not in a position to bring in somebody with that expertise. I can't afford their salary, but you can just, hey, here's a company. I'm finding a company in my area that believes in this concept of having both sides connected, and then just making sure that when either person has an opportunity, they're pulling the other one in. I love that.
Yeah, one could hire the other as a consultant.
Yeah,
as a
just figure out a fair
subcontractor.
price for that. Yeah, no, that's great advice. So let's move and start talking about the sales process, and how do you talk about this with the end client? How do you educate them? Because I would imagine, like you said, there's a lot of ignorance on their end. They're going, either they've got the means, and so they're going, I'm going to find an architect first, or they don't, and they're going to hire a builder, but then they're maybe going to be in some headaches later and wishing that they had somebody that did the design. So how do you approach it when you're talking to clients and trying to educate them and pull their knowledge up?
Yeah, I mean, a great client for us is one that is not naive, that's been through it before. That's either just hired a contractor or just hired an architect. Inevitably, I find these folks are like looking for something different or better. But one thing is, I put out a lot of content, so I'm talking about this subject a lot, and I'm educating folks about it. And then straight up, the ideal client for us is someone who is looking for an architect, and who has the means to do a significant project. Design is important to them. They want to make sure they don't have regrets afterwards. I want that person to find us. So our positioning and our what we present is very similar to what one might think is like just an architecture firm. But then those folks see that we build as well, and it's just simpler for them. And so even though these really affluent people who can do the project anyway, if you were to ask them, well, which way would you prefer? Would you prefer just to do the design and then find out at the end it's twice what you were figuring to spend? Or would you rather have that information like as you're going along and making decisions? They're going to pick the latter.
Yeah, it's a no-brainer. Yeah.
So I love that proposition when the client is looking to hire an architect and finds us, because I know I am a solution. I know I provide what that architect provides plus some.
Right.
But that's the thing where once you get to the higher end work, you do need to bring the design skills. Because that client, what's most important to that client is an amazing project.
Yeah.
And so if you're not on that level design skill wise as the architects, and that's where I think a lot of that higher end work is done on a collaborative basis.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so would you say it's easier for architects to transition to that because they typically are already pulling in the higher end clients, or do you think it doesn't really matter?
I do think so.
Yeah.
I would love for architects to go back to the root of the word. That's really my initial purpose was that. I think it might be too late. Because there's this new word now, it's design build.
Yeah.
And if you look in a dictionary, the architect is now a designer. Whereas 100 years ago, the definition was different.
Yeah. So now we've got a new word that's kind of replaced what architect used to be.
Right.
Yeah.
But
that makes sense.
Just thinking to the future, and we were talking earlier about education of our trade and craftsmen. But
Mhm.
if you look at the education of an architect today, it needs to change, and it is changing. There's over 100 design build curriculums now in architecture universities. And it's starting off as more of a token semester project, but over time, what's going to happen is that is going to be the top, the top of the funnel, if you will, or umbrella. And then that's going to be the major curriculum. And then you can specialize in design, or you can specialize in construction management.
That makes sense. Yeah. And so I know you're doing some things online in terms of trying to push content out and educate people. And I guess what's your vision for the design build movement? I know you said it's getting into curriculums, but do you have kind of this
Yeah.
like, hey, here's
I,
where we really want to get to?
yeah. I mean, the universities and the education is a big one for me. I do see that. But initially, target number one is just making the consumer aware of it, because
Yeah.
the consumer is going to drive the demand for the change. And the consumer, by and large, is not aware of design build at this point.
Yeah.
And that's real. In the industry, folks know what it is. But outside of the industry, the majority do not. Even though people love HGTV, that is all design build.
Yeah.
Fixer Upper, Property Brothers, even This Old House, all these shows are actually design build. People just don't even know it. And once they do start recognizing it, they already like it. It's the natural approach. That to have it split is not natural, and it was forced by laws and all this other stuff. And so it's a natural inclination to go back to it. I'm just trying to speed it up by making people aware of what it is. And then once that occurs, then the institutions are going to change. Then the establishments are going to change because they have to.
Yeah.
They're,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And I can see that impacting a lot of things in a positive way. I mean, you educate the consumer, drives the demand, drives, the curriculums and what's being taught. But then that hopefully fuels more younger generations moving into those types of classes and taking those because that's obviously a big problem right now too.
Totally. Like I'm a perfect example. I had no idea. Like
Yeah.
I was going to school to do the thing that I'm doing now, and I got out of school and I was deficient in my ability to do it. And that's where I say, if you are just that architect or that contractor and doing that in a silo, the first thing you need to confront is, am I really servicing the client as well as I could? Because I think the way it's set up is to not be that way. And it's also set up to be adversarial between those two professions. And you can go on pretending like that is totally normal and the way it's always been, but the truth is it hasn't been.
Yeah.
And so I just didn't want to pretend.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, David, this has been good stuff. I want to let people connect into the movement and that sort of thing. So for everybody listening that maybe wants to get involved or just participate in more discussions around this, where is a good place to either connect with you personally or what you're doing?
Thank you. It's called the Design Build Movement, Instagram, Facebook. If you just type in Design Build Movement, would love to hear from you, comment, collaborate. I do post examples of colleagues' work as an example of design build, because a picture says 1,000 words, and so really doing a great job as design builders. And I know this is an audience that is a lot of what I'm saying resonates.
Mm-hmm.
Us setting a great example is the first step, and this is really a forum for that. So would love to would love help in pushing this message and making the consumer aware.
Yeah, very cool. And we'll make sure to put those links in our show notes so people can get to the Facebook page and join that, and Instagram, make it easy. So before I let you go, we've got one last segment of our show. We call it the Fast Five. So it's kind of rapid fire questions. I'll hit you with a few of those, and we'll wrap things up here. So
Awesome.
first question is, what is your favorite business book and why?
My favorite business book is Be Obsessed or Be Average by Grant Cardone. And just because his mindset is totally not normal. And I feel like that's very true in terms of, to be great, you have to be different. If you do what everyone else is doing, you're not going to achieve greatness, and you're not going to excel at the level, because there's a bit of a complacency, and there's just, that book really just goes against the status quo, and I like that.
Cool. Yeah, I've been following Grant a lot more recently, and yeah, he's got some good stuff. And yeah, the mindset there is just off the charts. And so, yeah, that's a good. I'll have to. I haven't read that book, so I'll add it to my list. But
the audios are awesome with him.
Oh, cool. All right. So, who is the most inspirational person in your life?
Oh man, I'd say my wife. She beats me up a lot, and she keeps me on my toes. She's a competitor, so she really doesn't let me just do well in one area of life. I can't just work all day. I'll also have to excel as a father and a husband, and with my church and other areas of life.
That's awesome. Very cool. All right. If you could have one superpower, what would that be?
Oh man, I'll just be Superman. I don't
Superman.
know. That's not one superpower, so I'd say fly.
Flying. Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah,
all right. Describe yourself in 3 words.
Man, 3 words. I am crazy.
I like it.
Yeah.
That's a good creative way to get the 3 in. All right. Last question is, if you could leave our listeners with one piece of advice, what would that be?
Yeah. I mean, just confront the area, and, this design build. The thing I feel like I can bring the audience is the educational piece, because you can't get away from the truth of our history, and design build is just a return to the way it's been throughout history. And that, in terms of going back to the sales pitch and what have you, that in itself resonates with people, because the truth resonates with people, and it's simple, and it's a natural approach. And the greats throughout history, that's what they did. And so it's just the truth, right? So it's just simple.
Yeah. No, I like it.
Yeah.
Well, David, good stuff today. I appreciate you joining me.
Thank you, Spencer.
Yeah. All right.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. And we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, brother. Thank you.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that episode with David. Like I said at the beginning, I thought the history was really fascinating, and kind of how we had this split in kind of the architect and the builder, and why we are in kind of the situation we're in now. But I think he makes some good points about really the design build model, in terms of the terminology we're using today, gives the best output for the client. So a couple of action items. I know you guys are on the go, you're at the gym, you're in your truck. So first one is definitely join the Facebook page, follow the Instagram page that he's got going for the design build movement. I find that interacting with other people all over the country, asking questions as you're making this transition, there's ways that you can shortcut your success by learning from others. And even if you're already embracing the design build movement, there's always more that you can learn from others, and you can see little tweaks and kind of the nuances of that process and what other people are doing. So big believer in community and sharing and learning from others. So that's action item number 1. Action item number 2 is see if you can make the transition. So if you're not currently using the design build model and you are an architect or you are a remodeler or you are a builder, do a little bit of research in your local area to see if you can find somebody that maybe you can partner with to fill the void. I think it makes sense in a lot of instances, and you don't necessarily have to make the leap to hire somebody if you're not in a position to do that, and start building those skill sets into your organization, or at least into the end result that you can deliver for a client. So I think those are two great action items that I came up with out of today's conversation. And thank you again for listening. We're really building a great community here at Builder Funnel Radio. We're getting lots of interaction, good questions. And if you'll do me a favor, I would really appreciate you guys leaving a review, sharing this with a friend, and kind of spreading the word. Again, I'm a big believer in learning from others, and that's why we're trying to build this community here. So thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time on Builder Funnel Radio.